start recording. Bismillah. Alright, let's do it properly. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Welcome back to another episode of our history on the scales. Apologies for the long delay. Been quite busy. A lot of deadlines on the book that I am writing. So, alhamdulillah, we look forward to some announcements about that soon. Today's topic is one that is very dear to my heart and that I find very exciting, so I know you will enjoy it. And that is historical models and frames. Every historian sees the past through a lens. The question is whether they know it. So first, before we go deeper, what is a historical frame and why does it matter? Now, of course, when I use the term historical frame, a lot of synonyms would include historical model. That's probably the most used word. Historical framework, historical lens, and we'll be using that as well. Historical perspective, context, paradigm, worldview, mindset, hermeneutic. All of these apply, kind of are trying to get at the same thing, which is the meta behind the history. The trajectory, the unwritten rules about how it happens, right? We talked a little bit about Sunan. So Sunan would be one of the types of, or one of the aspects, for example, of the Islamic historical framework, right? So obviously it is very important. It is impossible to look at history without a frame of history, because it decides, a frame decides what is important, who is the main character in your story of history, who is the side character, what is more important, what is not. There is no book of history that focuses on plants or on even animals, although I guess some evolutionary history would at least begin human history talking about, our pre-evolution. So in a sense, those animals would be the main characters up until humanity comes into part. But yeah, that's an example of a model right there. So all of these sort of meta decisions, assumptions, all of these play into any historical narrative. And so what they are, identifying them, and learning to put them on and off will be the main goal of this episode. So to understand this concept a bit deeper, let's look at the same year and how different narratives see it differently. The year we're going to choose is the 1200s CE, Common Era, or after the birth of Christ, Isa. From one perspective, this is called, this age is called medieval history, right? This is what the Western curriculum generally teaches. It's the middle of a long, dark age that begins with Rome's fall and ends with the European Renaissance. So that is a perspective, right? And you could say it is true to very specific geography, mainly Western Europe. But is it true for the rest of the world? Yeah. Why do other places consider this their own golden age, right? The Islamic perspective is same period is considered the peak of our Abbasid era in terms of science, philosophy, medicine, all flourishing. Although I will say this is technically after the Mongol sacking of Baghdad, so definitely perhaps not the golden era, but a very short period after it. And the thing is, even after the Mongol sacking of Baghdad, science still, it was kind of thriving. Ibn Khaldun came after, a long time after the sacking of Baghdad, and many other great Islamic thinkers. And so thought and creativity and innovation definitely did not die in the Islamic world after the Mongol ransack, but that's a longer topic. What about other places? What about other civilizations? What about China? What about the Inca expansions in South America? What about what's going on in Russia? The Byzantine Empire in the east, like all of these different regions, east of Europe, all of these different regions, different things are happening, and so their narrative, their view of this specific year would not be the same as the European view, and so it is untrue, or it is insufficient to use the same glasses that you would use to look at Western Europe, places like Paris or England, and say that that same thing, that same trend applies there when it simply doesn't. The same year, completely different place in the story. That gap, that's what this episode is about. So frames are lenses, right? So one of the aspects that you might already be thinking is, okay, so which one of the lenses is true and which one is false? And the reality is they all have a degree of truth and falsehood, but it just depends on how you're using them. When you realize, okay, they don't apply and you have to put them off, and when you are putting them on. A frame is the organizing logic behind how history is told. So what counts as the turning point, who are the main characters, what is history coming from? What is history coming from and moving towards, right? So for example, let's look at the Marxist framework. It focuses on class struggle and economic history. Its starting points, again, it shares a lot of the assumptions with the other sort of Western isms. Things like evolution are kind of assumed, if not a core part. And what it's moving towards is a very specific, progressive idea of emancipation of the working class. It has a very specific vision of the future that it is moving towards. So that is the Marxist framework. Focuses on economic history and class struggle. And it has a poor lens for religious division outside of its specific context, right? Because the reality is Marxism came from a specific Christian, both Eastern Orthodox and Western context. European, if you consider Russia Europe, which is depending on which way you would look at it. But both those specific contexts and their religious backgrounds are what produced Marxism and the early forms of capitalism and so on. When you try to apply those same assumptions towards religion to other religions, namely Islam, they don't hold. Right. Let's look at the Islamic dynastic framework. Right. It focuses on caliphs and lineages. I do mention scholars here, but even scholars don't usually play a big part of this framework. But it depends on which version. And it has a poor lens for everyday social life of peoples. The history of thought is not. If you open At-Tabari, you're not going to get a good idea of the history of like Aqidah schools. When did Ash'arism start, for example? How did Salafism develop? These are not things that a traditional Islamic dynastic frame accounts for. But they do account for other things. They focus on other things. They're very transparent about what they are and what they aren't. And so they are useful in those focuses and useless for other things, right? If you're trying to look at Islamic civilization as a whole, you can't only use the dynastic frame. You have to use other frames as well to get a better picture of the full society, not just what's going on with the rulers. We already talked about the example of the Mongols and how even after the fall of Baghdad, science and scholarship did not end. So binoculars are not wrong, they are built for a different purpose than a telescope. No single lens sees everything. The question is whether you know what yours was built to see. And this is really where the danger comes, right? When lenses forget that they are lenses, right? When your historical frame becomes subconscious reality and unquestioned reality, right? So every story needs an organizing principle. Without one, history is incomprehensible mass of names and dates. Of course. That's point number one. Point number two. The deeper problems and frameworks don't present themselves as frameworks, right? We talked about, for example, the Western framework. A lot of Westerners presume that what happened to them happened to everyone else. What all the sunan that appear in their specific context are universal when they're not, right? Like, every religious institution is actively corrupting their religious text, just like the church. These are internal assumptions that they are never kind of spoken out loud, but again are just assumed, and so they never really question the glasses effect, right? the we're going back to looking at it as a lens. When you wear glasses long enough, and you can forget that you're wearing them. You know, how many times have you seen people with glasses, you know, are looking for their glasses without realizing they are literally on their face. The correction becomes invisible. The frame becomes in your mind simply vision. The prescription to this, so like you might be asking, what if I'm doing this? So how can I stop myself from doing this? Is that first you have to notice and realize what is a framework and what is like just facts, and how to turn them off and on, right? You know, in order to realize that you have glasses on, you have to take them off sometimes. That's kind of the only way, right? If you sleep with your glasses, I don't know how anyone would do that, but if you do, you could easily forget them. But to hold, you have to be able to hold them at an arm's length. And remember, these are lenses, these are not my eyes. That's enough for the introduction. So we'll talk a bit more in detail about Islamic frames and their different subcategories, and then compare them with Western frames, and then talk about our conclusion. Islamic frames, faith, authority, and the organization of the past. The generic Islamic frame beneath the Sunni-Shia divide lies a shared architecture that most Islamic historical writing operates within, often without stating it explicitly. So for example, what are some of these assumptions? Number one is that faith is the main engine of history, right? Faith is the central and most important factor in human conflict and flourishing. Not economics, not ethnicity, not GDP. It is a belief. It is what people individually and collectively choose in their hearts to believe in, to strive for, and how to live their lives. Right. This, of course, very opposing to the modern notion that belief is secondary to these other material aspects. Right. Another aspect of Islamic frames is prophets calling humanity back to monotheism, right? It is the spiritual, eternal spiritual struggle, right? You have this constant cycle of prophets beginning with Adam all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, you know, being sent to people who lose their way, and then the prophets come, bring them back to monotheism. People fall back to polytheism and other misguidance, and the cycle repeats throughout history. And then the final age ends with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after which official prophethood ends, and Islam being the quote-unquote final message. And then after that you have the Islamic age, which is the post-Muhammad, and it will unfold. The ending, of course, is the end of times vision of the Islamic, the whole Mahdi eschatology and so on. Probably get more into detail about that in a future episode. But this is not merely theology, it is a historical claim. It defines where the story begins, what it is about, and where it ends, right? Probably the best book that really encapsulates this vision is Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya by Ibn Kathir, right? A history book that literally begins with the creation of the world, the days of Adam, all throughout human history, continues to the time of the Prophet, continues on to the time of the historian, Ibn Kathir, and then talks about the end of times. You know, what history is heading towards the end. Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, that's the official title in Arabic, the beginning and the end. So we talked about all Islamic frames in general, what is their meta-assumption. Now we're looking to more details. So first we'll begin with the Sunni frame, then we'll talk a bit about the Shia frame. The Sunni frame, what makes it unique, right? Number one, definitely by most, is what I would call the consensus narrative, right? In fact, the Sunni, one of the main names or titles of Sunnis as a group is Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of Sunnah, way of the Prophet, and the people of collective agreement or consensus or unity. That's different ways to translate Jama'ah. Early and this view of consensus is very, very important to Sunnism, right? This view that particularly the early Muslim community, the first generations, represents a model of religious and social cohesion, and of ijma' and of jama'ah, that and this is throughout time, right? That the Sunni always wants to be part of the jama'ah, the collective people who are always guaranteed to be on righthood and not on falsehood. The second part of the Sunni frame is, of course, the hierarchy of proximity, which which shows importance. You know, the time of the Prophet ﷺ, his companions, Tabi'un, and generations after them. This is a hierarchy of trustability, if you will, and also importance, right? The same way, you know, let's say a Christian framework would put Christ as the most important period, or I don't know, post-Enlightenment historical narrative would put the Enlightenment as the most important period, and so on. The Sunni narrative always puts the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and then the periods after him in sort of descending importance. And lastly, sukut, deliberate silence, right? So this starts, of course, specifically with the companions. Classical scholars chose silence on the fault of the companions. And of course, their reason was their collective stature was so central to Islamic transmission that publicizing their errors would undermine the entire chain of authority. But this really goes beyond that period, right? Even after that, there's this general Sunni tendency to be silent about the mistakes of ourselves, of Sunnis and of the Jama'ah, right? Think of it psychologically as you know, a family that doesn't want to talk about their divorce, you know, like to especially to their young kids, you know, like two parents, when their kids are you know, when they're introducing their divorce to their kids, they wouldn't necessarily mention every fight and every detail and every swear word that they slung at each other. They would give them a very rosy picture of how things happened, of how things went down. Perhaps when they're older, they give them a more detailed version of events. Perhaps they learn from their uncles or so on. So that's kind of the psychological background to this instinct of sukut. So let's talk about some of the limitations of the Sunni lens, right? These three pillars produce a stable and internally coherent frame, but its limitations are real and worth naming honestly. Number one is the idealization of the early periods. The companions' complexity gets smoothed over. Disagreements are minimized. The historical record, rich with genuine serious disputes on theology, law, and governance, gets processed through a lens that prefers harmony, right? And the amount of problems that come from this, I could talk to the end of the day. I would say the biggest one by far is that it stops us from learning from the companions' mistakes. You know, the same opposite to how the Quran talks about the prophets, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not shy away from talking about the mistakes or the shortcomings of the prophets, you know, sometimes even calling out the Prophet Muhammad himself, however gently or lightly or politely in the Quran, at least 3 or 4 occasions of correction, direct corrections of Allah to the Prophet. This is just not how we write our own history, right? Not just at the prophetic time, but at the companions and the periods after that, and that leads to this kind of massive blind spot in learning from our mistakes. The second limitation is the Salafi flattening, right, which is kind of a more extreme degree of that. In some Salafi readings, this hardens into something ahistorical. The concept of ijma' as-salaf, consensus of the early generations, is invoked constantly, even when it does not apply. On major questions, that consensus often does not exist. Pretending otherwise is a distortion of history, not a fidelity to it. If you claim to be following the Salaf on a topic where the Salaf do not actually have ijma', you are lying against the Salaf. There's just no other way to put it nicely. Lastly, selective memory, right? Later favorite scholars receive similar treatment. Hagiography creeping into history. That frame that was designed to protect transmission can, when overextended, become a mechanism for suppressing legitimate historical inquiry. And we'll be talking in a lot more detail about that in the future. Let's talk a little bit more about the Shia frame, right? Authority and tragedy. So the core pillars and what makes the Shia frame unique would be the imamate, right? The legitimate authority after the Prophet passed specifically through the Ahl al-Bayt, the people of the Prophet's household, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the designated line of imams, right? Depending on the Shia flavor, right? 12 and 12, 7 Ismaili, 6 in Zaydi, and so on. Another point, of course, is Ahl al-Bayt as the vehicle of history, right? Even the prophetic times, pre-Muhammad, are seen through their familial connections, and after that, it's, the Prophet's, Islam's importance and authority, continuing through the lineage of Muhammad, is seen as just a continuation of that. The same way you have the family of Ibrahim, Abraham, Moses, and so on, continuing through Isa, Jesus, David, so on, all of these related prophets, and the prophet of Ismail, and so on. The Ahl al-Bayt are seen as a continuation of that, right? The Prophet's family are not merely important, they are the only true holders of authority. Their suffering is not a side story, it is the main event, right? And so you could really look at this in places like Karbala, right? And this points to the last point, which is commemoration of early wrongs, right? This is the exact opposite instinct that the Sunnis have when it comes to mistakes, right? Where Sunni historiography extends a presumption of soundness to the companions, Shia historiography commemorates the faults of those who were perceived, at least, of opposing the imams. And of course, most explicit with Karbala, right? This is an event that is sort of very hush-hush, even though both Sunnis and Shias agree on the main facts of the story. We disagree on how we tell it, how often we tell it, perhaps how much importance we give to it, and also the lessons that we learn from it. Limitations of this frame is that, taken to its extreme, the frame becomes a reading of the early period in which virtually every companion except a small inner circle is morally compromised. And trying to do so in every single age requires considerable historical gymnastics, right? Because this is not just the period of the companions, this is effectively all of Islamic history is seen as, like, I guess, a period or a people of hypocrisy who are not listening to the imams and not obedient to them, and yes, the mental gymnastics you need to do in order to keep that up as not small. It imposes a clean narrative of betrayal onto a period that was in reality far more complex and contested than either tradition, either the Sunni or the Shia, is comfortable admitting. What is worth acknowledging, right? And of course here I have to admit my own bias, right? Of course I'm a Sunni, or I come from a Sunni background. So I naturally have more suspicion towards the Shia narrative than I do towards the Sunni one. So. But even as a Sunni, I have to acknowledge that the Shia tradition has preserved accounts that dominant Sunni narrative had little incentive to maintain. Legitimate grievances, especially around the events at Karbala, are historically attested and must be reckoned with seriously rather than ignored, as some Sunnis tend to do. Let's talk about the sheer, we've talked about the individual ones, let's talk about the sheer limitation of all, and kind of the hidden cure. And yeah, a lot more needs to be said, but this is just an introduction to it, right? Shared limitation of both Sunni and Shia frames and the broader Islamic framework focus overwhelmingly, traditionally at least, on political and dynastic history, right? Talking about books of history specifically, tariq, right? Caliphs, governors, military campaigns, court politics. The lived experience of ordinary people is almost entirely absent. But what is the supplement, right? It's not like these other things are not cannot be found. You can find the supplement, for example, in hadith collections, much to the annoyance, perhaps, of Westerners who are ever so triggered by the hadith corpus. The hadiths are compiled with extraordinary rigor. They preserve not just theology, but intimate snapshots of daily life in the early community. Books of fiqh reveal how ordinary people navigated marriage, commerce, inheritance, and dispute across centuries. Books of poetry and adab capture emotional and social worlds that political chronicles had no interest in, the manners, the humor, the preoccupations of entire social classes. And this is a smaller category of literature, but still an important one, and that is travel literature, right? Asfar, or books of Safar, Tirhal and Rihal. Ibn Battuta, probably the most famous example, gives first-hand anthropology of radically different regions, cultures, and customs within and beyond the Islamic world, right? You could go on and on. There's books of geography, books of science. All of these give snapshots of different aspects of the reality of Islamic history. Well, and just to put a small comparison at the end here, right? Where while Christians still debate the appearance of Jesus, right? How many times have you heard people arguing over the skin color of Isa alayhi salam? Muslims know the Prophet's different hairstyles, clothing preferences, favorite foods, sleeping habits, and cleaning routines. The depth and breadth of preservation is without parallel in human history. Right? Could confidently say that the Prophet ﷺ is his life is the most vastly documented life in pre-modernity. Right? So just try counting up every hadith ever written. Right? Good luck. Now let's move on to the next topic, which is that of the Western and modern frames. Before examining individual schools, we need to establish the shared atmosphere, the assumptions that ran beneath virtually every Western framework, regardless of whether it is liberal, Marxist, nationalist, post-colonial, or otherwise, right? And number one is suspicion of religion. Right? Religion is treated as something to be explained rather than something that explains, right? A power structure, a political tool, rarely what its practitioners claimed it was. This is not neutrality, it is a philosophical commitment dressed as objectivity. Ironically, the tradition remains culturally Judeo-Christian in its calendar, moral intuitions, and concept of linear, meaningful history. So it's still kind of there, vaguely in the background, but definitely something that you need to be careful of at minimum, or extremely dismissive of in its extreme. The second assumption is, of course, Eurocentrism. Right? The presumption, rarely argued and never proven, that Europe is where the important things happened. Non-European civilizations are peripheral until they come into contact with Europe, at which point they become relevant. And lastly, the isms as a human default. Right? Liberalism, capitalism, feminism, secularism, democracy. All of these modern ideologies are assumed to be universal, presented not as historically contingent European ideas, but as self-evident truths, right? American Declaration says it plainly, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Right, one of the best ways to view this last point is that these isms do not form a coherent whole. Much of contemporary Western political conflict is best understood as rival isms squabbling over precedents, each claiming to represent the true destination of history. Right? You have liberalism, which is in direct tension with capitalism, capitalism in direct tension with socialism, feminism in direct tension with egalitarianism, secularism in direct contention with religious equality, democracy with technocracy, progressivism with conservatism, and so on. So much tension, so many contradicting ideas and isms that it resembles sort of a Greek pantheon, traditional Greek pantheon, right? You have, the god of war, the goddess of strategy, and different people believing in them existing, but choosing to worship and glorify and focus and commemorate different ones, and fighting with each other over which one is the most important, right? The same way Athens and Sparta might have one day fought over their gods. Modern Westerners fight over their isms, right? So that is what has replaced the past. So let's look at kind of how the history, or how these isms developed, right? Where did they come from? And so, of course, in the classical antiquity, these isms were nowhere to be found. You have the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, however you say his name. Mediterranean-centric history equals great individuals operating within the constraints of fortune, right? So you see that religion being core part back then. Of course, you also have the Christian period, but not that much was written and it's not that impactful, so kind of skipping it here. And then you have the Enlightenment, reason versus superstition, right? Voltaire, Gibbon, Hume. Progress is real and directional. Religion is primarily an obstacle. Ancient/medieval/modern realization is born here. Particularly at the beginning of the 19th century, you see the rise of the nation state and kind of official attempts at objective history, right? Von Ranke, who we talked about in Germany, writing the first kind of objective history, trying to strip away that religious bias that is found through the previous works. Colonial powers exported this framework worldwide through their own educational systems. In the 20th century, we see the sort of the rise of these rival schools, Marxism, and also history, post-colonialism has its birth here as well in the later period. Competing engines, and no consensus. And lastly, we have the kind of the reign of, or the dominance of the post-colonial, post-everything period where most of the modern Western framework is very, or Western academy is very focused on critiquing previous modern models, but not that interested in developing new ones. So a lot of people are actually putting the glasses, all of their glasses off, but not necessarily putting any new ones on. And of course, an example, I'm going to go through this fast because this point has been kind of beaten to death. But you have the European Dark Ages, 1314 to 1453. You have the collapse of the Roman order, the reign of church authority, suppression of reason, barbarism and stagnation, dominated by Vikings and similar barbaric raids and expansions. In the same period, you have the Chinese Golden Age, relative prosperity in Constantinople and Eastern Roman Empire has a bit of Baghdad al-Khwarizmi. And the algebra has been seen as canon of medicine, global trade networks, a framework that cannot say that this is not describing history, it is describing Europe and calling it history. And again, there's no problem with calling this European history, but there's a big problem with calling this world history, because it is not. And in the 19th century, exporting the frame, we have the more, history professionalized. So we already talked about all of this. So, yeah. We already talked about this as well. So I'm just going to skip the three assumptions, right? So, kind of talked a bit about the background. Let's talk about the assumptions that are shared, right? Suspicion of we already talked about this, right? We'll talk about what they missed, right? The suspicion of religion, of course, is that the suspicion that you have in Christianity is not universal, it doesn't apply to Islam, it doesn't apply to other religions as well. For example, the tension between religion and science is relatively unique to Christianity. It's not the same everywhere else. Eurocentrism, we already talked about the problems of that, and lastly, the isms as a default. These isms are just not universal and don't work everywhere. So, yeah. Conclusion. Historian's frame reveals what the historian finds most important. A frame is a claim about what matters. A frame is not necessarily distortion. It is an argument about what is most important in human history. Right? Certainly, historical frame claims that the chain of transmission from the prophet through his companions is the most important thing that happened to human history, worth more of your attention than any battle or economic shift. Enlightenment frame, the liberation of the human mind from religious authority, is the central drama of civilization. The thing that above all else explains what we came from and where we are going. The Marxist frame, the people who were never in the chronicles, the peasants, the laborers, the dispossessed are the real protagonists of history, and they will, quote unquote, seize the means of production and then fix everything, right? Which one of these is true? Kind of your pick, right? Histories of the past, it is what we make of it. The stories that we choose to tell, the lessons that we decide to draw, the ancestors that we claim. It is two parts, right? The first layer, which is the content, the events, the figures, the causation, what most people think they read for. Valuable, but incomplete. the dates and the names don't mean much without the second layer, which is the frame, the organizational logic, the implicit assumptions, the things so obvious that they go unstated. That is where the real argument lives. Once you learn to read the frame, you cannot unlearn it. Every history book becomes two books, the one the author wrote and the one about why they wrote it and how they wrote it. No frame has the right to be invisible. Every frame earns its authority by being examined, tested, and found genuinely useful, not by presenting itself as simply the way things are. So some questions to always consider and to keep in mind when you're analyzing a book of history. What does the historian think is the engine of history? What is driving force behind people's actions in the turn? What do they treat as turning points? And what is the background? What is being intentionally ignored? Who are the protagonists and who is missing? What do they treat as obvious? It doesn't need to be stated. Are they convincing you? Perhaps most importantly, are they convincing you that this is truly what matters and why? The answers will tell you as much about the present as it does about the past and the future. Barakallahu feekum. I'm also going to be posting a link to my Discord server if you wish to join us for some advanced discussions. Barakallahu feekum. Appreciate you sticking through this long episode. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.